through that research, we put through a once every 25 years, we put out something called a regional plan. So there have been four, but the most recent one released in 2017. And that's largely our guidebook for how to make sure we keep our region healthy, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous. So what do I do? So it's different every day. And I will say that at first glance, it might not even appear that my role closely aligns with environmental justice and sustainability, but I promise you it does. So, as a vice president of transportation, I pretty much tell people that at RPA, if something moves people and or goods throughout our region, I have to have an opinion on it. So I have, as you heard, Bregan read through my bio, I have expertise in both freight and passenger transportation. And so I spend a lot of time advocating for safe roads, safe streets, for environmentally friendly ways to move people and goods around, and for continued investments in public transportation. And housed in all those conversations, making sure that we're not transferring harm or creating additional harm to different communities throughout our region, especially on those that have been experiencing environmental injustice over time. So my day can look really, really different. For example, this morning I was speaking to the capital program team at the MTA. Last week I spoke to the Port Authority about drones. A couple weeks ago I was on TV talking about congestion pricing. It really just depends on the day. I'm in the paper. We're at press rallies. We meet with, governors, mayors. It really just depends on the day. And so because of that, I think that's actually what makes my work very exciting. I'm someone who gets really bored with doing the same thing over and over. And so my job allows for a lot of variety. And I'm doing my job across three states. So you can imagine the challenges related to environmental justice and sustainability and the transition to cleaner transportation systems. That conversation looks different in New York compared to how it looks in Connecticut and perhaps how it looks in New Jersey. So happy to take any questions later on about that, but that's pretty much what my job entails every day.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
I can follow that. So I'm also a planner. I'm a planner and project manager for SKIO Solutions. So we're a company that works with EPA's Superfund redevelopment program. And you probably all know, but Superfund sites are just some of the most toxic sites in the US, and EPA has a mandate to oversee their cleanup. So after sites are cleaned up, they're put back into beneficial reuse. So I work with a lot of community members, local governments, tribes, and other community groups to kind of figure out what beneficial reuse looks like there. So this kind of includes a lot of technical analysis, so figuring out what you can do with sites after they're cleaned up, and also facilitating a lot of community dialogues. So we just want to make sure that we understand what people who live around these toxic sites want to see happen after they're cleaned up. So just making sure that everybody has a voice in that process. And similar to Tiffany, and I really hate doing the same thing over and over and over again. So this is a really great job for me because I'm never doing the same thing twice. Every day is different. And I work across the country, so a lot of different communities, a lot of different dynamics. And it keeps it really exciting. And I get to do a lot of creative problem solving and really tailoring solutions for each group and each site. So yeah, that's a little background.
That's great. Thank you.
Thomas, you want to keep the order we were in before, or would you like to go last?
Sure, no, go. I can go.
Go for it.
Well, so basically what I do is that I am a consultant working at a large consulting firm, but the sector that I serve is the international development sector. So as a lot of you might be seeing on the news, it's been quite challenging over the past 3, 4 weeks in terms of the entirety of the international development sector, especially in the US. But in terms of what we do to support them, we support them in both their programs, but also support implementers and strengthening their organizations. And in particularly, what I focus on in my work is in the nexus of climate and environment, but also in Africa. So a lot of the work that I do is related to these two topic areas, but also we work a lot across things like education and livelihoods, also inclusive finance, and things like sustainable finance comes up a lot in terms of how do we channel and funnel additional funding to support development across the world, for example. So in terms of what I do and what makes it exciting is also just like what the two others mentioned before. I think every day is definitely a different day, and then the breadth of the projects are, and then the opportunities to, and the people that I meet and work with are definitely quite wide ranging, right, across different topics, across different countries, and across uh, different topics as well.
Super, thank you so much.
All right. So describing what Dominion Energy does is probably a little easier than the fellow panelists because it's some of you in the room, if you're from Virginia, you may be our customers. Dominion Energy is a regulated utility company that provides primarily electric energy service. We have small portions of our corporation that serve natural gas distribution. That's the, if you have a gas stove in your home, we're the folks that run the line to your home from the main line so that you can use that service. So that's the utility work that we do. We work in primarily 3 states nowadays, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. We have a couple other areas that we have small holdings in, but that's our home base. And in those areas, we serve several million customers. The number changes. It's over 3 million in Virginia, and I think similar in South Carolina. So our business is keeping the lights on every day, every second of every day for every person in our service territory. And I guess it's worth pointing out that electricity is a foundational thing for everything else that happens in our world. So that's kind of how we view our work at Dominion. We're powering everything else that folks want to do every day. So my role, I sit in, Dominion's a kind of a big company, right? And there's different businesses within the corporate umbrella. There's a Virginia company, there's a South Carolina company, etc. And then there's also something called a corporate services group. And that just might be interesting information for you guys who are thinking about, any big company that you work for might have a similar organization. The services group does stuff like IT and human resources, et cetera, legal, compliance work, security across the whole organization. And then we also have an environmental permitting group, or an environmental and sustainability group, so that's our full name, that sits there too. And we provide environmental compliance advice across the whole company. So anytime, a project team in Virginia wants to build a new transmission line, they come through our corporate environmental permitting group to get all the correct environmental permits that they need to do that work. So 5 years ago, Dominion created an environmental justice policy. That part of that policy was hiring dedicated environmental justice staff. I drew the lucky straw and became the first ever dedicated environmental justice employee at Dominion Energy, and possibly one of the first dedicated employees of that type at any utility company in the country. There's only a small group of us. And so since then, I've been building an industry-leading program that implements a screening system across our construction projects to look and see, characterize the surrounding community, ensure that we have equitable community engagement strategies in place, and that includes tribal engagement. And also to look through things, project impacts, and to work on design, make sure that we're minimizing those impacts and responding to community concerns as we hear them. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. And I agree with everybody else. My job is also never the same any given day. I've been working on documents to submit to the State Corporation Commission in support of a new power station that we're trying to build today, all sorts of things like that. But what I really like about the job is the intersection of everything, right? In this moment where this clean energy transition is unbelievably important. And I'm proud to be working for a company that has already made great progress on that. We've cut our carbon emissions by over 40% in the last decade. We own second largest solar holding of any utility company in the country. We're building the largest offshore wind farm in the nation. We're doing a lot of new technologies in the nuclear field and so on. So it's exciting to be in the middle of a company like this that's leading technologically and in the social justice realm, trying to push ahead and do something new and different on environmental justice. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
That was wonderful. Thank you. It's really nice to hear about how all your roles are varied and how you can do something different every day and just how excited you are about all your roles. So our next question. Are you guys seeing that? Okay, there's a delay. So what inspired you to pursue a career in the environmental and sustainability field? And specifically, since we're on the topic of environmental justice, what drew you to those roles? And again, you guys can go in order or in whatever order you'd like. If you're jumping on your seat to answer, please go in order.
Regan, you've got to call on us. We can't self-regulate.
It's up that goose. Tiffany Ann, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. What's really interesting? I did not become a transportation planner specifically because of my interest in the environment and sustainability. There's a couple of things. There are lots of urban planners who do. I just wasn't one of them. For me, actually, and I'm definitely dating myself, but even the term sustainability is a newer term. I didn't really come across it until I was in graduate school, and that was about 2007-ish. And that was really a buzzword at the time. Now it's something that, as a vocabulary word, is much more commonplace. So I do want to throw that out there. But I actually always tell people this story because I only learned about urban planning from being at William and Mary. It was my last semester there, my last year there. I took a class called Urban Sociology. And that class taught me all the vocabulary words that I didn't know existed about things that I think I had been living and experiencing. So I'm originally from Long Island, New York, and that is essentially the birthplace of suburbs in America. And so I'm from a town that's actually 2 towns over from where Robert Moses is from. And there's actually today a life-size statue of him. Without going over too much detail, Robert Moses is actually an infamous character in planning history because he shaped so much of New York State, but unfortunately did that by displacing lots of communities of color, low-income communities, and really taking advantage of funding and governmental systems that we now have protections against today. And so I live and grew up in a place that has actually like lots of beautiful infrastructure, of course, at a terrible social cost, but I didn't know that that was all by design. So it wasn't until I took urban sociology where I learned about cities being living organisms and neighborhoods being living organisms, and that they can grow and that they can die and that they can shrink. And I understood what white flight was, and I understood what gentrification was, Tower in the Park, all of these different typologies and descriptions of how environments, right, physical environments could change and shift. I actually learned that in my last semester at William and Mary. And it wasn't until later on, at first I thought I was going to be a lawyer because I think everybody wants to be that for a little bit. But then when I realized that that wasn't for me, I found, I said to myself, well, I actually was really interested in urban planning. Let me learn a little bit more. And I did my own research and I realized you could get a graduate degree. I realized that there were graduate schools in New York and I wanted to come back to New York. So that's where I'm from. And then, the story goes on. I ended up working for all the entities you heard earlier. And so I think right now, what draws me to the environmental justice component of my job, quite honestly, it's because of my lived experience. So I identify as a Black person, also as a person of color. I'm also a first generation American, meaning I am a child of immigrants. My family came here from Jamaica. And so I'm walking through the world with a different set of lenses from some other folks and shared by others. And I think that those lenses and those experiences have let me both see the world and experience the world differently, and understand, I think even more so, how many people from communities that identify with those characteristic traits have been disadvantaged through environmental injustice, and I think especially through transportation infrastructure. And I think also we'll probably get to a little bit later, but my experience being a person of color and a woman, and often those characteristics not being dominant in the spaces that I predominantly work in, has also continued to encourage me to want to care quite a bit about transportation equity and transportation's impact on the environment.
Thank you. I really love how you tied your own identity to like what drew you to your position. So thank you. Let's flip it around to the back. So Katie, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, and a lot of what Tiffany says rings true to me in different ways too. Environmental justice was not a tagline of any kind on any major or any job I'd ever heard of until I was already working, and I was working as a educator before I took this role. So I just came across the job ad, and as I told you, I was the first person to ever have this title at the company. So you can imagine like how I was kind of looking at the job, like scratching my head. And another thing, I mean, those in the room don't know me personally real well, but I'll like let you in on a secret. I am not someone who ever thought that I would work in any kind of industry or corporate world. I am a like radical change agent. That is how and I thought, well, I'm never going to fit here. And I even had that like insecure thought when I was reading the job ad, but I was like, okay, I have a job that I like. I'm reading this ad. It's really exciting and it's like something new. What's it going to hurt me to apply? So I did at the interview, right? And then I'm going to the interview thinking the same thing, like, oh, I don't even have the word EJ like anywhere in my resume, right? Like I'm a biologist, I'm a spatial analyst, I'm a member of a Pamunkey tribe, so I have some of that lived experience to bring there too. But it didn't matter, apparently I did get picked in the end. So I don't know if, that helps you understand that your degree doesn't always relate directly one to one, especially in its terminology to a job. So that's, I think, a great thing that I learned in that process. And what drew me to it was the lived experience. But to finish that story, so I look at the job ad and then I start Googling, of course, right? Because I'm like, well, what is this job really going to be about? Like, what kind of rules and stuff are out there, definitions of this? And much like Tiffany explained in that class you took, like, as soon as I started reading the literature, I was like, oh, I know what this is. Like I've been living this every day, right? So it just gave me the terminology to come in and just do the job, and just figure it out. And that's really what I've been doing. So lesson for me is go towards what you love, but also like don't let your insecurities hold you back. Put in the job application, sell yourself, right, and point out how you can do the job and just go after it. And don't be if you think you can't do it, then you're right. Right. So that's the first thing you got to get past. Thanks.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's good to hear from both of you how both these things, sustainability, environmental justice, have been around, but the terms for them haven't, or they've been rebranded or become buzzwords and then not. So it's really good to hear that through like lived experience, you realize you do know what those are and you do care about them. Thomas, would you like to go next?
Sure, of course. I think while I was at William and Mary, sustainability was definitely already something that, we're talking about, people are aware, but not really like environmental justice, right? I think that really definitely has been something that has been more of a focus in the past couple of years, but then we'll see how it goes in the next couple of years. But back to why I wanted to pursue career in environment and sustainability. I always knew I wanted to do things related to international development. And then I think in development, it inherently links with sustainability. So in my head, it's both international and sustainable development, right? You can't just do international development by, how folks are actually criticizing on TV right now, right? There's definitely a lot of things to think about in terms of how development can be done, right? So whether it is climate and environment, or whether it's global health, whether it's education, whether it's inclusive finance, there definitely is a sustainability element into all of it, right? Whether it's physical financial sustainability or whether it's actually long-term programmatic sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. But back to what we think about as sustainability here in this group, and then why I decided to focus more towards a climate environment space versus a lot of the other subsectors within development. I think one of the main reasons is that over the past couple of years, there definitely has been a lot of push and the climate environment space within development was growing by a lot. So like the World Bank, IMF, a lot of these big development institutions, development finance institutions actually have goals in terms of how much, what certain percentage of their funding will have to be focused on climate environment, right? I'm sure in the US, in the planning setting, there are some funds that has, that are being allocated also has some like climate, right, lens climate focus. So one of the main reasons was that climate environment was definitely growing within the sector of development. But another reason was that, having had the chance to go with the Global Research Institute to go to Kenya, I was working on a climate environment focused project and development project. And so that really helped me fortify that after William and Mary in my work, day-to-day work, I really wanted to focus in this specific area of climate environment within international development. And lastly, in terms of environmental justice, I wouldn't say that's what I'm doing day to day, but there definitely is a lot of components. So a lot of our work, especially in Africa climate environment, is focusing on green jobs, focusing on just transition. And so there definitely is an environmental justice angle, right, in terms of energy access, green jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But I wouldn't say this is kind of like the lens that I think of, right, on a day-to-day basis, but there definitely is still a lot of parallels and connections. And I think we just need to be very mindful when we're thinking about environmental justice, how it is, right, here in the US might be a bit different on how others think about environmental justice as well. And in what context, right, are others? And do they even have or is this even a priority for them, right? Where there are so many other things that are in a higher priority. So I think we just need to, be have all of these kind of different dimensions into account when we think about, environment, think about sustainability, and more specifically, environmental justice as well.
Thank you. I really appreciate you not only pulling out different aspects of sustainability, saying that you can't have IR without sustainability, but also how environmental justice is different based on the context and perspective. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Sophie, would you go next, please?
Sure. Yeah. So I initially was just interested in geology, and then kind of similar to Tiffany Ann, my senior year of William and Mary, I took a sociology class, and it all kind of clicked for me. I started getting like the verbiage, started thinking about the way that humans interact with our built environments, and I just started getting really interested in that. And it's so interdisciplinary. Everyone else has kind of touched on this, but it relates to public health, it relates to science, it relates to city planning. Everything is so tied. And then it's really hard not to find yourself working in the environmental justice space when you're doing this type of work, especially the type of stuff I'm doing with Superfund redevelopment and brownfields, because inherently a lot of these types of sites are located in environmental justice communities. So I often find that's just built into the work.
Thank you. Yes, so once again, interdisciplinary, environmental justice, sustainability, everyone works here in like some aspect of sustainability, and it's just good to hear how everyone came from very different backgrounds in school, but then still ended up in some sort of environmental or sustainability sector. And I think a lot of people in this room probably relate to the fact that maybe they're in a major that doesn't relate to what they want to end up in, or maybe they've taken one class like sociology and that kind of like puts them on a new track. So going into our next question, what obstacles have you encountered in pursuing your career path, and how did you overcome them? Maybe this time, I know Sophie, you just went, but would you like to start? That's okay.
Yeah, sure. So right out of college, I was working as a consultant. I've been a consultant most of my career. But I was doing a lot of research and writing for EPA's Office of Water, and I really liked the job, but I started learning more about green infrastructure and city planning, and I really wanted to kind of make a shift. Um, So I just started talking to people. I started reaching out to people who had the job that I wanted, stuff that I was interested in, and just networking and making connections and sort of learning more about the different types of jobs. I don't even think I knew urban planning was a thing during my time at William and Mary. But that kind of led me to start looking at graduate programs, and I ended up going to UVA for their environmental planning program, and that kind of helped me transition into a position that is, I think, better aligned with my interests and my strengths.
Great, thank you. Yeah, as we are situated in the Cohen Career Center, I think networking is a good term to use right now. Tiffany, would you like to go next?
Sure. I've been waiting for this question. Because there's been a lot of obstacles and I like to talk about them. Let's see. I think maybe the biggest one is, I mean, it probably pales in comparison that we just live or maybe are living through still a pandemic, but the 2008 recession. Yeah, I see some folks shaking their head. So that was a huge deal, right? And so I had already graduated from William and Mary, but I hadn't, and I was still in graduate school, but I hadn't finished yet. And I am not someone who is trained in engineering or architecture or urban design. I use the other side of my brain. I like to say I'm policy, strategy, education, that type of stuff. And at that time, what I was seeing more in my field, at least in this part of the world, was that it was easier to find, if you could find work in this field, it was easier if you had more of those technical skills, more of the math and the hard science skills. And I did not. And so I was unemployed for 3 years before I got like my first, what I call my first big girl job, which was working for the county that I grew up in, Suffolk County, as a planner, right? That was my first job in economic development and planning. That was one obstacle. And then other obstacles, quite honestly, throughout my career, I've dealt with a lot of isms. So racism, sexism, ageism, you name it. I have absolutely experienced it on the job. I've dealt with sabotage from coworkers, from folks who were managing me. I've had instances where I've been pushed off projects, where I've been intentionally excluded from projects. I've experienced jealousy on the job. And I'm not sharing these things to frighten you in any way, shape, or form. But when I'm asked to speak to students, I like to make sure that they're getting a balanced conversation or a balanced viewpoint of the conversation that we're trying to have. Like you're seeing me now being very successful at this age and talking to you, but it was not a straight line. It was very much like an up and down experience. And you should know that everyone experiences that in some way. Um, so how did I overcome some of those things? I think quite honestly, the first thing you need to remember is that you can leave any job at any time. Sometimes we forget that that is an option. It is not an easy option, especially if you might be the main breadwinner in your family. Maybe you're the first to go to college or graduate from college. Maybe you have children or other caretaking responsibilities. Maybe your rent's high, like whatever maybe you need the health insurance. Like those are all very, very valid reasons. So I don't say it lightly, but I do think it is important for you all to remember that you can always leave a job and you can get another one. So I've had to do that multiple times in my career. Actually, in order to advance, I've had to leave the environment and get a better job in the next opportunity. I've also very much found my community. So who are the people that I'm immediately surrounding myself around, right? Not just through regular friendships, but also through peer mentorship. Like many of my, because the reason why I mentioned in the beginning that I'm a child of immigrants is that in my experience, where people emigrate from the Caribbean and come here, and I think this is shared by others from other countries, is oftentimes your parents kind of limit you to the types of jobs or the type of education their children can have. And it's typically doctor, teacher, lawyer, or nurse or engineer. And those are amazing things, but if you notice, I did not say urban planner. So what that means is there are no other urban planners in my entire family on either side. There is no one else who works in transportation in my entire family on either side. So I often found mentorship through my peers, through people who are roughly about my same age, through people who had shared experiences and shared interests with me. I also did traditional mentorship programs where I was a mentee and then later on I was a mentor. And then lastly, quite honestly, I've often created tools for myself. Like I have created things to exist because I know they didn't exist for me, and I know if I needed them, other people needed them. So Bregan mentioned earlier that I'm the creator of a conference that was called the Hindsight Conference. It's no longer running, but if you Google it, all the information is still there. It was a conference that was national that I created that ran for 5 years, and it was centered on urban planning through the lens of equity. And everything about it was incredibly intentional, down to the food vendors that we had each year. And I co-created that with other folks because that was a space that I know that I needed and I wasn't seeing. Today, in my current job, I've also co-created something with a good friend of mine. She and I both are women of color in transportation in New York City. And as you climb the ladder in those spaces, that representation gets smaller and smaller and smaller. We created our own Women of Color in Transportation and Climate Networking Group. And that's been a space where we've been able to introduce folks to each other, even though their agencies or their entities may talk to each other every day, they don't know that a counterpart or someone who looks like them exists. So I would say that also throughout my career, I've created things for me to help me overcome some of these obstacles as well.
Thank you. You talked about being a very logically minded person, but I think you're quite creative as well. So that's amazing. Thomas, would you like to go next?
Sure. Uh, in terms of the main obstacle, to me, is like understanding the actual science. Like I'm definitely like a social sciences, humanities person, and I didn't take many of like the more like traditional science classes at William Mary, and that's not, a strong background that I have. Like I took like intro to like integrative conservation. I know that's a big thing now. Someone mentioned Rob Rose earlier. So like I'm not an adaptation expert nor a mitigation. And then now I'm doing a project on climate intervention, which is about like solar radiation modification. So that's a lot of aerosol science, a lot of atmosphere science. And I don't really know the science, but being a generalist, right, you know a bit of a lot of things and you're able to kind of piecemeal things together, hopefully faster than most others. So I think that's where I've been able to use that as an advantage. But like not knowing the science sometimes definitely is an obstacle. Like when I have to read through like these IPCC reports, I'm not like understanding all of it, right? So it's a lot of like Googling, watching YouTube videos, learning. And so in terms of like overcoming, a lot of it is just like spending time with yourself to like try to do a bit of upskilling here and there, asking folks, right? Not being afraid to ask folks. And yeah, so but like because not knowing a lot of the science behind the work, that really has made me think like how, right? And then when maybe it's time to actually be a bit more systematic about kind of, diving a bit more deep into, let's say, mitigation or adaptation or whatever, just to be a bit more, being able to offer others a bit more in the future rather than knowing a bit of a lot of things, which is great, right, at this current stage, right? But I think definitely, going deeper is much needed later on.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to hear about the reality of being a generalist and having to kind of look into things on your own. And I know I've had conversations with some of the people in this room about when you're on the job, like, can you look things up? So it's good to hear. Katie?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that was a good one. The answer to that is definitely yes. don't not use a tool that you have. That would be my advice. But let's see. To this, so many. I love the synergy, like listening to other people give their answers because I see similarities with both the ones we've already heard. I graduated with my undergrad in December of, I think it was 2011, which was like, or no, excuse me, 2007, which was like 2 months after the Great Recession started. So yeah, so I didn't do with an undergrad in biology, there was like literally no job, not even a chance. You needed 10 years of experience to even get an interview at that point. So grad school was the obvious answer, but I wasn't ready to go back to grad school. I don't know about you guys in the room, but I was like 22. I'd, gone straight through high school and 4 years of undergrad. As many other people at William and Mary experience, I came from a very high pressure family situation. Like my household was the one where like A minuses got questioned. Like it was like, why isn't this not 100? Like, so there's a lot of pressure. My sister's a surgeon, so there you go. And like, I just felt at that point as a 22-year-old that I needed a break. Like I just, so that's what I did. I took 5 years. I moved to Oregon actually, which is a totally different place I'd never been before, and I ran my own business, which was a food cart for a while. So it was just totally different. I would never go back and do it differently now. Just all the lived experience you get from doing different things, it always ends up being valuable one way or the other. But eventually I went back to grad school and at William and Mary, and then that's what got me into teaching and then eventually this role. So the lesson in that is you're not always going to know exactly what you want to do. I think like Tiffany Ann said earlier, like it's okay to leave something, to change, to take a break. Like it just have faith that it's all going to work how it needs to work, right? And then I love also what Thomas said. That applies for my job right now. I started at Dominion. Didn't know anything about the energy industry. Like I didn't know what a transformer was on a power pole, and just all the other stuff. So the first like 2 years, every day was just like looking up acronyms. Like, what is that? What is that? Over and over. And eventually it sinks in. But I think the piece of advice I would give is don't be that person who hears something you don't understand and then thinks it's not important. Right? Like be the person that says, I don't know what that means, and I'm going to find out what it is. And when you do that, that's when you become an extremely valuable employee to any organization.
Thank you. Those are all such great responses. And it's very good to hear as a bio major who does not want to go to grad school right away that it worked out. So our next question. What characteristics and skills have been most useful and valued in your area of work? Trying to do the different order. Thomas, would you like to go first this time?
Sure. But did Sophie, did you get a chance to answer the last one? Okay, good. All right. What characteristics, skills, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, well, I just mentioned how, I didn't know the science, and I think that's something that definitely is sometimes an obstacle. But what the skill that I think I have the most is actually just being able to adapt quite fast and then knowing a bit of everything, right? So if you're able to talk with someone for like 5 to 10 minutes about adaptation, about mitigation, about climate intervention, about environmental justice, about, let's say, the just transition, green jobs. If you can do a bit of everything, then you become quite flexible. And I think being flexible is also quite important, right? And having a balance between those two, right? Let's say being deep into, let's say, urban planning or transportation, or being very deep into green jobs, right? I think that's all really good as well. But I think when there's a pros, there's a cons. So I think all of this, right? And especially for folks that are still in college, I think this is a time to like explore a lot of things and then figure out what you're more passionate about and what, you know, links you a lot more, and then start to focus. But having the skill to be able to like pivot fast, adapt, right? And then being able to be knowledgeable enough to have a conversation about a lot of things, I think is really valuable. So people will want to come back to you and then have such conversations. And then that will lead to more opportunities, whether that's being able to sell work or building trust, confidence with clients, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so I think being able to, be quite dynamic is also quite valued.
Great. Thank you so much. Sophie, would you like to go next? And I'm sorry if I skipped a milestone. My notes are legible to very few, including me.
No, you got me. Don't worry about it. Yeah, Thomas, I love what you said. I think that was some of the best advice I got early in my career was it's better to be a generalist. It's better to be able to adapt and to know a little about a lot of things and maybe a lot about a few things, but it's you can always learn on the job. And I'm constantly Googling things, and especially working for federal agencies, there are so many acronyms. I am always Googling acronyms, it feels like. But yeah, I think research and writing have just been really through lines for me. I think just being a strong writer and being confident in communicating your thoughts and being able to communicate to different audiences well is something that's hugely helpful. And then being able to translate kind of technical materials if you are more in a scientific role or um, have, people maybe with no science degree who you're trying to communicate with, it's really, really helpful just being able to boil down things to their simplest form and just be able to put it in front of everyone or anybody, and anyone can understand. I always send things to my mom, and if she can understand it, then that's kind of a good basis for me, sort of the simplest level for scientific information.
Thank you. Great idea. Send it to your own personal layout. Katie, would you like to go next?
Sure. I love that. Send it to the mom. Yeah. So I agree with everything everyone has said so far. Maybe I'll throw something out that's like slightly more controversial, if you will, because we're talking about the EJ and social equity space, and I work in industry. So let me just give you the real talk for a minute. Not everybody in industry is on board with this stuff, right? We know this. So for me, something that was really important for the success of the EJ program within Dominion was finding a way to speak about these issues that is not polarizing and that is inclusive, even of folks who are not people of color, right? And who maybe aren't going to agree with you on some of the foundational things that relate to it. So being able to talk about what is the right thing to do, but also talk about how beyond it being right, there are also real tangible benefits to the organization that come from that. That is really critical to my role. And the other kind of piece of that, I think, is also that line between like being an ideologue and being a pragmatist, right? Like I have personal beliefs that I bring to my work every day about what is right, but I also have to acknowledge that there are real world limitations to what is possible, right? And so when you're able to compromise basically and hear what you want to do and here's what's possible and find the middle ground, like that's I think what we're obviously missing all across the country right now, right? And that is just important for us all as you get into this world to know whatever your personal beliefs, you're going to come against people that aren't going to agree with them. And you've got to think, how am I going to show up in that moment? Right. And if it's, I don't want to hear you, you're wrong, that's not going to do well for your career.
Thank you. Having conversations in non-polarizing ways is definitely an important skill and a very hard one at that too. Tiffany Ann, would you like to finish off this question?
Yeah, this is all fantastic advice. I co-sign everything, especially Katie's point. If you are even, I'll take it one step further. If you're even able to translate what you're talking about into dollar figures, that is a universal language that everybody understands. So wholeheartedly agree. I just want to reiterate a couple other things too that Sophie mentioned. The communications piece, especially if you're an urban planner, it's like getting people to believe you is a whole other conversation. Just getting people to understand you is actually your job. If you cannot communicate what you're there for, you've lost the plot, I think everyone is saying these days. And so, whether that's digitally, whether it's through crayon and tracing paper, whether it's you standing up in front of a room, and don't laugh, like I've given presentations with tracing paper and stencils, like even in 2025, sometimes that's just how you interpret information. Like understanding your audience and understanding how to communicate without insulting people is so, so important. It's very important, especially if you end up in a field where your focus is caring about and advocating for environmental justice issues, right? And then the other thing that I would add on to reading and writing, The other thing that I would say that William and Mary taught me, and by the way, William and Mary was super hard for me. I just want to put that out there. Like, I came in as a top 10 student out of like 600 students, and I struggled when I got there. It was really, really hard. But the thing that I took away the best, there's two things. One is I read so much. I was so tired of books when I graduated. I read so much to get my degree. But because of that, I can read any document, especially a government document, and tell you what's not in it. I learned very, very, very intensely at William and Mary how to literally read between the lines. And that's really important, especially in this line of work. And I would definitely say my ability to write. It is something that made me sail through graduate school with ease. And it's something that people look forward to me today in my current job, writing grant applications, writing speeches on behalf of executive officials. Like my ability to write is also something that has been an incredible skill. But I'm telling you, if you can read a document and figure out what someone did not put in there, that's absolutely a skill set that'll serve you for the rest of your career.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Many people say ability to write is an important one. That's why it's in the curriculum. But reading between the lines is also very important, and I don't often hear that one. I think we have one more question before Q&A. Switching it up again. Sophie, would you like to go first on this one? It's what advice would you give to an undergraduate, us, interested in pursuing a career path similar to your own?
Sure. And I think this is just kind of general advice, but just talk to people, like reach out and ask for what you want and don't be afraid to come across as pushy. You're allowed to follow up. People are busy. I think people appreciate it. And yeah, just making connections is super helpful. My very first job out of William and Mary was actually a former William and Mary student uh, posted something on a job board, and I ended up reaching out and talking to her and learning about the job, and I ended up getting the job. Um, but yeah, just ask for what you want, ask for what you want to be doing, figure it out, make connections, and I think people are always willing to help you and kind of pay it forward. So just don't be afraid to do that.
Great, thank you. And yeah, we have a lot of resources now for connecting with alumni. So Thomas, would you like to go next and answer this question?
Yeah, no, I think the same thing. I mean, just like what you did to all of us, right? All four of us. Like you reached out and then that's why we're here, right? If you didn't reach out, like we're not gonna be here. I wouldn't, meet the other panelists and get to know you as well. So same thing, just be proactive, right? Maybe don't be aggressive, but be proactive and then, go out there and get it.
Wonderful. I hope I wasn't aggressive when I approached them. Tiffany.
Sure, I have two. So in transportation, if you find yourself in transportation, and if you find yourself in the New York region particularly, prepare for heartbreak. But be persistent. And by heartbreak, I mean I've been in the industry 10, 15 years at this point, and I am still working on many of the same projects that I worked on when I first started, just from a completely different angle. I mentioned my organization's over 100 years old. Some of our ideas that are 30 years old are just now being put into place now. So in this region, things are expensive to build, take a long time. And so sometimes you can have your heart broken over and over again when they don't happen, but you have to just be persistent. And then the second thing, and I think this is particularly for anyone who feels as though they identify by a demographic that is not overly represented, just because you don't see someone that looks like you doing the thing that you want to do doesn't mean that you can't do it. That's really, really important. Basically, like representation matters, but in many instances, we don't see ourselves represented. And I'm not just talking about race. Maybe it's you have a disability, maybe you're, again, first generation in some other way, whatever way you identify. If you have an interest in that thing, go and do it because you very likely may end up being the person that people look towards in the future. I often find myself in that way. If you look at all of the transportation agencies in the New York City region, the large engineering and consulting firms, if you look at the top two levels of leadership, there are far and few between Black women. There's probably less than five. And so for a long time, that signaled to me that maybe I can't go that far. But now I understand that maybe I'm just going to be one of the first to do some of those things. So it's really important. Just because you don't see yourself represented doesn't mean that you can't do that thing.
That's a really good point. Yeah, if you don't see a representative, like become the representative, you can do it. Katie, would you like to finish off this question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I kind of already pointed out that, you go after that your degree doesn't have to match up with the job title. What I would add to that here, I mean, so I didn't mention earlier, I'm now a manager and I hire people to work on EJ at Dominion. And what I would say is that really put yourself in the if you're really trying to game out how to get a job, right? Put yourself in the shoes of the hiring manager, and know that the hiring manager is sitting there. We are given, we create a list of criteria, put it out in the job ad, and then you send us your resume. Sometimes you get a whole bunch of them, and you're trying to figure out, who's matching up with my criteria, because that's important. You have to document that inside the organization, right? So my advice to you would be, when you write a resume, every job application you submit should be a custom resume that is customized specifically to the job ad. A blanket resume, I do not recommend unless you're not serious about getting the job. So whatever job it is, just draw a map for that person reading your resume. Here's what I did, and it's exactly how I know how to do this thing in your job ad. And if you're doing that, then it doesn't matter what your major says or anything else, right? You're just showing them, I have what it takes to do this job. So that's my advice to you. And good luck.
So those are actually all the panel questions, and we're going to go into Q&A. But while we're on that point, one of the submitted questions kind of ties into what you just said, and Katie might be best to answer this since you do some hiring. Someone asked, in the day of like AI, is there any way to tailor your resume or cover letter to be fit for the job? And then especially if you don't have the needed experience they say you need to have, is there a way to do that if AI is just going to look for that experience? I don't know if you have an answer or if anyone does.
Well, my gut is that Tiffany Ann probably hires as well. So I'll let her jump in here too. But I would just say off the top, I don't know how AI is relevant to that question, so I'll just kind of set that aside. I mean, whether you're using AI or not, whoever's doing it, right? I think what I said kind of answers that, is that if the job is saying like I need 5 years of X experience, whatever experience you do have, whether hopefully it's 5 years or if it's close to it, like it just needs to be like really blatantly pointed out in your resume. That's what I'm getting at. It's just really don't like get lost in like perfect resume template stuff. Like your resume needs to be an understandable document. So use common sense first and foremost, and don't be worried like, oh no, it's going to be formatted differently or something, right? Like just make it say what it needs to say. That's what I'd say. Tiffany Ann, what did I miss there?
Yeah, I think that's right. I haven't really I'm assuming the question is because maybe someone's using AI to write their resume, which I think might be like a whole other panel. But I would agree completely with Katie. I would also add that, take my opinion with a grain of salt, but like I actually do read cover letters. And I find that because of my organization, this is going to sound boastful, but I promise it's not. Our organization gets a lot of applications every time we look to hire. Like I was trying to hire someone over the summer for one role and I got over 150 applications. That's very common for us, right? And we're only 30 people big. And so I mentioned that because at some point, all of the resumes look the same. Everyone has a graduate degree in planning. Everyone had these professors. Everyone did this internship. The cover letter often tells me a little bit more of a personal story of the candidate. And so that does get my attention. I will also say, like, as much as I would agree, don't worry too much about like template stuff, but don't skip the basics. We do notice misspellings. We do notice when things are off because, again, we need that for professional competency and you need to be able to demonstrate that. So, those are things that I would add. And then also, lastly, like if you are going to use AI, remember that if you do score the interview, AI is not going to help you with the interview. So, make sure that whatever you're putting in your resume is something that you can actually speak to in real life.
Wonderful, thank you. Thomas, do you want to?
Yeah, no, no, I'm not hiring anyone, but like I would try to take this one step further. We started with the resume, we talked about the cover letter, but in the situation when there's one job posting and then 150 applicants, and that happens all the time, let's just like try to reframe the thing and then think about how do you get it onto the top, right? So really it's all about knowing the folks, right? So I think what precedes the resume and then what precedes the cover letter is actually figuring out what jobs to apply for. How do you get to know the folks that are doing the hiring or their peers or their colleagues? And how do you get there? Maybe even before the job posting comes out, right? So I think that's key to everything versus like stressing out about the cover letter, stressing out about the resume. That's all good, right? I think those are like basics. But if there are certain things that you really want to do that you're interested in, right? Pursue your career, blah, blah, blah. Then I think what makes it easiest to secure the job actually is to lay it up before even you're applying for the job. And so when the job posting comes out, then you're like half set already, right? Then you just have to go through the process of applying because if folks know you, they know your capabilities, they know who you are, they know you come recommended, the whole package. So I would try to reframe this whole thing a bit and then actually think from the end and then go back.
Thank you. That's a really interesting way to view it. Does anyone else have anything, Sophie, or anyone want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I would just say, I think the other panelists have spoken to this, but just every opportunity you have, just make the most of it, whether it's knowing people in the organization or being able to use the cover letter to tell a, creative story about yourself, and personal story, like Tiffany Ann said. I think just being really careful just to utilize those opportunities.
Thank you. So that was the only submitted question. So now we can go to Q&A. So if there's people in the audience with questions, if you have questions, please speak loudly at the microphone. Yeah, Alicia.
Okay. Hello, can I get a head nod if I'm able to be heard right now? Just like a yes. Okay, I see yes. Hello, I'm currently a senior and I'm doing my capstones. I'm getting ready to graduate. I'm really excited, but I'm starting to feel like maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. Like, wow, am I really qualified to enter the workforce? I just want to know, like, any personal experiences with like graduating, going like, man, I think I forgot everything that I learned these past 4 years. How am I ever going to get a job? Just things like that.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like imposter syndrome. It is a very real thing. The funny part is you don't know everything, and that's okay. To be quite honest with you, I'm also teaching. I tell my students graduate school for me was just baseline information. Like, these are the processes that you need to know. These are the influential authors. These are the topics at hand. Really, the bulk of my career has been learning on the job. I think you also have to give yourself a little bit more credit for a couple of reasons. One, William and Mary is a very rigorous school. There are people that still say that to me, like, and it was my undergraduate degree. I was like, I went to a whole graduate school afterwards, and they were still more impressed that I went to William and Mary. So it's a very academically rigorous school, and so trust and believe you're smart and you know a lot of things. Um, also give yourself more grace because you are in right now an academic vacuum of being on campus, right? Where it's your job to just learn all day and absorb. But you will be challenged on the job in very different ways. You will be challenged to address problems, think of solutions, create new ideas that will force you to actually pull from your experience of being on campus. And then also, it's okay to admit when you don't know something. Like I said, like, you will be learning on the job, you will be getting mentorship, you will be getting professional development. So have confidence in the fact that you absolutely earned your degree, and just also remember any of the 24-hour nights that you had to have finishing a project.
Thank you.
I would say, just for what it's worth. Yeah, imposter syndrome is real. We all feel it. In fact, I remember right after my graduate degree with Rob Rose, he had me teach a semester of introduction to GIS at William and Mary to undergrads, to your peers. And I felt like an imposter teaching that class because William and Mary undergrad is so tough. So the students were ahead of me in the class. So it never stops. It's every day, and you'll just learn to live with it and then get over it. I think you'll be fine.
Thank you. Are there any other notes on that question? Otherwise we can.
Yeah, just whatever job you get, you're going to be learning. You're going to be learning a lot. And so I agree with what Tiffany Ann said. I think grad school was great, a lot of baseline information, but definitely learning on the job has been the biggest experience.
Thomas, any other notes, or we'll get the next question?
Well, I'll just maybe a question for the other panelists. Tell me if you disagree, but I mean, most like I don't want to even label them as entry level, but like kind of entry positions, you're not expecting somebody to come in and know what to do on day one. I don't really, I wouldn't in my world. I'm expecting to spend a day explaining you how to get around the office and how to log into all your computer stuff, and then assigning you a peer mentor. And there's probably going to be 3 or 4 weeks of just like shadowing and like just drinking it all in. So, yeah, that could be the other side of it, is that maybe the expectation isn't even that you have to know what to do on day one.
I'm expecting you to be interested. That's actually what I'm expecting from you. I'm expecting you to be interested, and maybe even show me, that you're paying attention to current events in your field, right? Like, for my example, like, do you understand what's happening in the transportation world in the tri-state area? Do you know what the biggest projects are? Do you know what the biggest headache is? Like, I want you to show that you're interested, because then I can definitely, I can work with that. So I would agree.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah. Hi, y'all. My name is Sean Matthew. I am a fifth year. I did my undergrad here at William and Mary in economics and environmental policy. And I'm doing my master's in public policy. I'm going to graduate this May. Actually, I did apply for an environmental policy analyst job at Dominion. So, Katie, I will be reaching out if that's okay. But my question is, given the recent scrutinization over environmental justice over the last month or so, I was wondering if you guys could talk about how you're navigating the current situation, and also maybe what you're optimistic about, like opportunities despite current events.
I don't mind starting on this one. So working for the federal government, every administration is different, but especially this one, there's so much scrutiny already on environmental justice and DEI and all of those kinds of terms. So we kind of touched on this at the beginning of this call, but it's not always the words that are important, it's the work. So just it's important to get into the communities and be able to do the work no matter what you're calling it. That's more important. So I would say I'm hopeful that environmental justice work and work like this will continue, even if we have to call it something different.
Yeah. Does anyone else?
The EPA and USAID share the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C. And literally, if you walk to the Ronald Reagan Building right now, you can't even see the letters USAID at the Ronald Reagan Building. At least the EPA flag is still flying, and let's hope it continues. But all that being said, right, I think when there's things that are happening, right, and then when there's quite a radical shift, there people who are working in this space still has responsibility to do as much as they can to continue the work that has already been started, right? So there are now huge voids, but the voids need to be filled. So whether they're in official capacities or in unofficial capacities, how do we bring additional resources? How do we create new coalitions to address the needs, to address the voids, right? So I think, yes, everything is being quite scrutinized right now, and a lot of people are feeling a lot of pain, right? Anguish, everything. But again, unfortunately, right, there isn't a direct answer and a direct solution, but sometimes us as individuals just have to do that reframing a bit ourselves and then think about how we as individuals can continue and support and then be part of the good fight.
Yeah. I would also add like now's the time for creativity, to be quite honest. Like, what do your collaborators look like? What does your funding source look like? Can you have a private sector partner? Obviously still in line with your missions and goals, but what does that start to look like? Maybe maybe this is now your opportunity to enter into a relationship with an entity that you couldn't before. So I would say that. I think from a mental health standpoint, something that I mentioned earlier, sometimes you have to leave. And that doesn't mean you leave the sector. Many times it might mean that you just leave that role and go work on the exact same thing someplace else. So remember that's an option. And then to the second part of the question, I want to share something that a colleague of mine shared with me that actually has really reframed this for me in a very positive way because it has really been a challenge. She works for our governor. She said that she actually feels very lucky to work in a sector where she's trying to affect positive change at this time. And she felt like if she had worked in other sectors, she would feel very helpless and would be struggling with ways to help and effectuate positively. But she feels like it's actually a privilege to be paid every day to work in the sector to do good things. And so that is the stance that I have taken on as well. And I think probably a lot of folks on the call can relate to.
I'll just tag on maybe a little bit of like a more specific policy response to that. And sorry, can you repeat your name, individual who asked the
Yeah,
question?
it's Sean Matthew.
Sean Matthew?
Yeah,
Sweet,
that's
Sean. Yeah. Because and knowing, I know actually exactly what position you're talking about, and that in that policy analysis world, right? So kind of coming from that angle. Um, and also, let me specify that I'm speaking now solely about actual specific environmental justice policy. Because I mean, I have picked up on throughout this conversation, we've been using EJ in a really big, broad way. But in my world of legal compliance, which is really what I do, it's actually a fairly narrow concept. And of course, not to be confused with the broader and umbrella concepts of DE&I in general. And then you could also put in other terms like climate justice or energy justice that brings in climate or affordability and reliability angles. But environmental justice is defined as disproportionate environmental impacts on certain groups, right? And so it's specifically about environmental impacts, not all hiring, not none of that. It's about, are you impacting the environment? So in that world, actually, I would argue very little has changed. What Trump has done is he has wiped EJ policy off the federal executive branch. But, however, from a legal compliance standpoint, that actually changes nothing. The Civil Rights Act still exists. The legal requirement for fair treatment, under which almost all environmental justice litigation has been filed, still exists. The only thing that Trump has done by removing the EJ executive orders is he's removed the federal agency's obligation to check up on fair treatment through the permitting process. Now, what that does for a company like ours is it increases the risk that we would be issued a permit that would not be, representing fair treatment. Now, our company has me, that's part of my job within the company to also be thinking about these things, but a lot of other companies don't have that resource internally. So having the federal agency be aware was really important, right? So that's gone now. But it doesn't change the end game, which is fair treatment under the Civil Rights Act. It also does not change the Virginia Environmental Justice Act or New York and New Jersey's environmental justice and Connecticut's laws, right? And all the other state level laws. So that's my more narrow policy analysis on what has changed. And I think it's not much. The final piece I'll add to that is, you know, setting aside my personal views of the current administration, which are not rosy, my I would say, though, that I do think it's important to have balanced conversation about these issues. And so that's what I see. I see this as an opportunity for folks that were on the far left of the ideas. And there are, let's be real, right? There's a middle ground and then there's extremes on both sides. And I do think that there have been people pushing EJ too far to the far left. And this is an opportunity to balance it out and be a little bit more moderate and pragmatic about how we actually apply these concepts in reality. So that's what I see. Opportunity for reforming partnerships with people who 6 months ago thought the company was the enemy, but now they realize the federal government is their new enemy. So we'll see where that lands.
Cheers to new enemies. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for framing that in like a new and positive way. It's really helpful. Does anyone else here have any live questions? Alicia?
Just a follow-up. You all have listed these really like incredible skills, just drop them casually throughout this entire session, like being able to read the room, like these kind of skills that can't be taught. I don't know, how did you develop these? Was it like mentorship? Was it just life experience? Is it something you had to stumble through and figure out? Just like these kind of soft skills that aren't really talked about much, but you hear all the time. How did you develop those?
Yes, love to talk about that. Personally, I also vocabulary means a lot. So if you noticed before, I use the term technical skills in some instances. Some people will say that's a hard skill. I used relationship management before. Some people will say that's a soft skill. I don't use hard and soft skills because I think, especially when you start to apply gender at the workplace, those get different values. I think in addition to answer your question, it's actually all of the above. For me, I can't really point to any particular tool or instance that has helped me figure these things out. Have I made mistakes? Yes. Faux pas? Yes. Um, I think for sure peer mentorship, like I talked to you about before, especially because, right, looking from my like familial background, there wasn't anyone I felt like I could talk to about what I do. Formal mentorship, yes, I participate in formal mentorship programs, and in my application, I actually specifically requested a Black woman who was a planner because up until that point, I had never met one before, so that was essential for me to understand. I would say mimicking in some instances. I noticed on the job a lot of in past jobs, a lot of the my young white male counterparts were getting information and opportunities that just like weren't widely broadcast. And then I realized like folks were getting coffees, folks were hanging out, folks were setting up regular meetings just to check in, even though they worked at different entities. So I started doing that. And I do that today very, very much. That person I mentioned, I told you, she said she was lucky to have her job. She works for the governor. I met her through someone else and I approached her and I said, "Hey, I'd actually like to get coffee with you just so we can talk." And now she was so pleased with the conversation. Now we have a standing monthly coffee, right? Like, is that simple? But I mimicked that from watching my white male counterparts do that with each other. Yeah, I think it's all of those things. And then, oh, the thing I can't believe I haven't brought it up yet. Therapy. I'm a huge, 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 huge advocate for therapy. I think especially as someone, again, who's experienced uh, trauma from working in certain work environments or maybe being raised in certain work environments, feelings of isolation, understanding how my cultural heritage as split between two worlds, like immigration and first generation, how that has then showed up for me on the job, what it feels like to be in a predominantly white space, which I did experience tremendously at William and Mary, and then realizing how I would then show up in other jobs that were similar to that environment. And it's not just therapy, it was my therapist today is another Black woman. So there's a safety and a level of trust that I'm able to express with her that she could walk me through in helping me find my confidence. So I think it's actually all of those things. And I can understand how it might seem overwhelming or it might seem like, will I ever get to that sense where I'm comfortable and I have all these skill sets? Yes, you will get there because there's also time. Like you just saw on the screen, I graduated in 2005, which I realized earlier was 20 years ago. So there's time, right? There's a gap in time between you and me.
Thank you.
That's a pretty good answer. I could just say, hearing Tiffany and talk about that did make me think about, like, I'm somebody who's known to be very, like, very direct and very frank with people, and that is not like what you think of when you think of like politically savvy. But to Tiffany Ann's point, my one of my first bosses at Dominion came from the government affairs side and was very good at that, and I definitely learned from her. So I would say, yeah, second on the mimicking, look at people you think are good examples and try to imitate. And the other piece of it is too, just like Tiffany Ann also said, I think you're going to make mistakes with it. So, just keep on trucking. People will get over the mistakes. Don't like overthink it when you do something wrong. You'll be fine.
Thank you.
Any more tips or response to that question?
Yeah, just on the mistake front, it hurts the worst the first time, and then every mistake you make, because you're going to keep making mistakes, gets less bad and less bad. And I promise you, nobody else remembers as much as you're holding on to it. And I think that was a learning experience for me in my first job. I thought something was the end of the world. It's not. It's way easier for them to keep you on than to fire you and hire somebody else. So don't worry too much about it.
We might have time for one quick question if there is any. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much. If you do have any last remarks, tidbits that you were like, wow, I really want to share that, or anything, please do. Yeah, any remarks or tidbits? If not, that's okay.
I'll put a plug out there. Here's my plug for don't discount industry. I look at it this way. You can change something from the outside by tearing it down or from the inside, right? And so you can make change from the inside. We need more people with the social equity mindset in industry. Corporations are not entities of themselves. They are made up of individuals. So it's worked out pretty well for me, and I think it can work for others too.
Yeah, I would second that from a government side, since I've spent most of my career on the municipality side. You can absolutely affect change while on the inside. Absolutely. The conference that I mentioned that I created, I did it on the job, and I got my government employers to both participate and sponsor. So it's not that you can only fight these big fights from the outside. The other thing that I would add is that your generation has so much more access. And I am not even sure that you all realize it. And that is something to harness. Think about social media as a really helpful tool. Think about how fast your phones work. Think about the concept of something going viral, how to both promote yourself, but also to learn. I think if I said the Dewey Decimal System or the card catalog, maybe only Katie knows what either of those things are. Maybe Sophie does a little bit because, like, her parent told her something. But I say all that to say you actually have a lot of accessibility and a lot of technology at your fingers. So be creative. Creativity is something that's really, 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 really important in your job. And so that's why I said to you earlier, just because you don't see somebody doing the thing that you want to do doesn't mean that you can't do it.